Visby. I can't hear you. And hello world on the internet. It's a pleasure and honor to open this conference. So I'm super grateful to the organizers. Thank you, Sarah. And it's a disaster that I picked this topic. Actually, I can't see the slides. Do we have more technical problems? Okay, so I'll be operating these. Yeah, why is it a disaster? Because I realized that talking about how heritage is engaged with in role plays means nothing to the global audience unless they know a little bit about the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the country whose heritage we are talking about. This means that I have to start with a brief journey through the ages. That's what I want to do in the first 10 minutes. It leaves me much less time to talk about role plays. So I also decided to cut most of the academic theory. It won't fit into the 30 minutes. Although if I do have a few minutes left, I will give you a brief outline of the theory I use in my research. So that's what we're going to do. How the PLC emerged and collapsed as a state. Then the next sort of 10 minutes about how its memory is used as heritage and communicated after it collapsed, and ultimately how role plays and reenactments engage with the said heritage narratives. An important note, the history of Poland is tied closely with the history of Lithuania, Belarus, and Ukraine, because the history of Poland had only 3 years of solitary history, just the emerging Kingdom of Poland, followed by 400 years of different stages of union with the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, and then another sort of 100 years of shared trauma under Russian rule. So in Poland, the memory of this pre-colonial, pre-partition PLC is a major resource to which the Poles referred to under occupation. So a few maps from Wiki Commons. This history starts actually not with Poland, but with Kievan Rus. You can see it on the large scale map. So the first lasting political organism emerging from the Slavic and also Finnish tribes in the Middle Ages was the Kievan Rus. As you can see, it was gigantic, from the White Sea to the Black Sea. So most of today's Ukraine, Belarus, part of Finland, part of Russia was in this political organism. Actually, it was more a federation of small principalities, multiple principalities, but nonetheless, they were united as this huge Rus, like Grand Duchy of Rus, with the capital first in Novgorod, then in Kiev. Poland emerged to the west of this organism. So you can see the red map. This is Poland. But these maps are in different scale. So can you see my cursor? Poland was this small part next to Kievan Rus. What about Lithuania? Lithuania was it's a very small top right corner on the second map. A few years later, like 100 years later, you've got a gigantic Grand Duchy of Lithuania and no Kievan Rus. What happened? The Mongolian Empire crushed the Kievan Rus. And then when Mongol power declined, the small pagan barbaric Lithuanians emerged from the forests and conquered most of the former Kievan Rus. So we had the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. Interestingly, the elites abandoned Lithuanian Baltic culture. So we did have Lithuanian peasantry speaking Lithuanian in the north, but most of Grand Duchy of Lithuania was actually old Ruthenian Rus lands, Orthodox faith, Ruthenian speaking. So the official language of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania was Ruthenian. And the Kingdom of Poland emerged on the, well, you can see how the borders changed. In the late 14th century, Poland and Lithuania formed a personal union. Essentially, the Poles got the Lithuanian Grand Duke elected our king. So it was one ruler holding two separate states. And you can also see the Grand Duchy of Muscovy would be Russia, forming further east. And if we fast forward, you've got how you can see how the Grand Duchy of Muscovy grew into a large empire. So when Muscovy came into power, they said that they want all the former Kievan Rus, all the Ruthenian land for themselves. So Lithuania was threatened by this newly emerging power, which even strengthened their ties with Poland, which led to a formal union. When the two states merged into one, the name was the Commonwealth of Two Nations. In the English-speaking historiography, it is said the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. So at its largest, it managed to push would-be Russia back for some time. But 200, actually, the Russian power prevailed, and the whole Commonwealth was partitioned, carved up into pieces by its neighbors. Mostly Russia, but also Prussia and Austria took part. So this country disappeared from the map. And then for like the last 100 years of occupation, we had a formally existing kingdom of Poland, recreated after the Vienna Congress. But who was the king of Poland in this kingdom? The Tsar of Russia. So formally, it was a separate kingdom. Actually, it was still ruled by the Russian monarchy. So what you can see on this map, you can see the shape of the PLC before the partitions. And the colors show how much of it was captured by Russia. That's the green color, whereas the white sectors are Prussia and Austria. So actually, Poland, part of Poland was under German influence, another part under Russian. What happened later? Well, this Poland re-emerged as an independent nation after the First World War. Then it entered the Soviet bloc, so back into the Russian spheres for like 50 years. It left the Soviet bloc in 1989. So we have different stages of independent or Russian-dependent Poland, looking back to the past of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth as sort of the main national narrative and sort of identity. Also as a continuation of the Kingdom of Poland, but as I said, we had 300 years as a separate kingdom, 500 years as different unions with Lithuania. So it is remembered as the rise of nation and also as a source of national trauma under partition and occupation. So how the colonizers, the invading empires that carved up the country into pieces, wanted PLC to be remembered. The so-called authorized heritage narrative they created pictured Poland as an inferior civilization. So already the Enlightenment period, like the development of the colonizer ideology, that we have a high enlightened civilization in Western Europe, and it has the duty to civilize inferior nations. They even issued press packs sent to French philosophers, the main influencers of that era, explaining to them how the Poles were simply incapable of self-governing and self-reforming, and they needed this sort of white man's burden idea. They needed to be led to enlightenment by someone else. The Germans even developed racialization, depicting the Poles as dark-hued. The emperor said that the Poles were simply Indians or Iroquois of Europe, formerly, well, white sort of center of Europe, but they are like the savages in the New World. Max Weber, whom you know as the creator of still famous theories of culture, he started with theories of race, depicting the Germans as the superior and the Poles as the inferior race. So that's Max Weber. How today's Poland remembers PLC? So now we are entering the stage of heritage narratives being created after the fact, after the PLC was gone. So one narrative reaches to the memory of parliamentary democracy, because in this state we had an elected king. We had a well-developed republican political culture with all nobles, well, just nobles, but all nobles were supposed to be free citizens. And they created law that even the king was supposed to follow. The king was not above the law. At least that's what the political culture tried to achieve. So that's heritage narrative. That's in bold. Then you have a little commentary from history. So it wasn't as beautiful as it looks on the agenda in theory. And also this political culture visibly waned throughout the centuries. So we could say middle-class nobles, it's not middle class actually, but relatively wealthy nobles had significant power in the 16th century. So they could actually stand up to wealthy magnates. They could bring them to justice, for example, execute laws which made it impossible to hold too many offices in one hand, and that was actually happening. Magnates were being stripped of illegally held positions in the 16th century. In the 18th, all career was made possible only through magnate oligarchy. So it changed. Another feature of heritage that is cherished is a rare religious tolerance. There was an act establishing religious freedom and tolerance for all Christian religions, and also Jewish and Muslim communities were tolerated with some autonomy. So if you want to build heritage on top of it, it's a great narrative. If you look into actual history, you can see loopholes and degeneration in this idea as well. Another major point in this heritage is memory of military superpower, including the capture of Moscow and the famous winged hussars, which again was true for some kind, but at the end of this period, the PLC period, it was no longer true. Yet another point in this heritage is the vision of Poland as Catholic bulwark, standing against the Muslim threat and standing also against non-Catholic. Actually, in the 17th century, all countries we fought against were non-Catholic, which is one of the reasons why religious tolerance declined over the centuries. Another common narrative you hear about this country, this state, is that it was actually an oligarchy of mighty magnates, former princes and dukes of Kievan Rus, who held immense estates. Some of them had their own private troops, etc. And the last narrative focuses on relations between the nobles and the peasantry. So this was a state of serfdom, serf labor. Some scholars who apply post-colonial theory to history, they also claim it was actually a form of slavery. Some of them claim it was even worse than African slavery, like Poland as the worst country in terms of cruelty versus peasants. And one last point, one last major aspect of this heritage is the meeting point of the East and the West. Like a huge country whose like western half, less than half, was Catholic and mostly Polish, also partially German, using Latin script, Catholic and Protestant, while civil liberties, this political culture of the nobleman's democracy was stronger. The East was the former Kievan Rus part, Orthodox, Cyrillic script, Ruthenian speaking. And then there, the power of those mighty princes, it actually never waned. It only grew stronger. In relations to other countries, what emerges from this heritage is the memory of Russia as the eternal major threat, Ukraine as a troublesome neighbor. We had fights, bloody conflicts within PLC between Ukrainian uprisings and the state, and Prussia as a threat and Russian collaborator. So Poland sees itself as stuck between the German power and the Russian power and having to fight on both fronts. And also Islam, we did have a few wars with the Ottoman Empire and we were being raided by Tatars. So Islam as as a threat is on the map, but it's one we were able to handle. So to put it in some order, I organized these heritage discourses in 4 major blocks. And now I'm going to tell you which communities, which political, social communities like to subscribe to which discourse on the Polish political scene. So there is this narrative about the PLC as the roots of parliamentary democracy, rule of law, and tolerance. If you want to build narrative, to build heritage on this image, then you reach primarily to the early period of the PLC, and also even before that. And this view is championed by liberal Democrats, some Protestants, and EU supporters. Because this country looked very much like a predecessor to the EU. It was multinational, multi-religious, multicultural, with different regional autonomies. Another popular narrative is championed by the Catholic Church and the conservative circles. So they reach back to the religious tradition, to the religious heritage of counter-reformation, and they focus on the later periods. Yet another very popular heritage narrative is number 3, that is actually a shameful state. It was a failed state of corrupt oligarchy and feudal anarchy. So this civil liberties held by nobles can be commented on as some great proof of evolution from feudalism towards democracy. But when you look at it through a different lens, you can see it's actually feudal anarchy, like nobles standing above the law, trying to stand above the law. And this narrative draws mainly from the history of the pre-partition decline, the last stage, and also directly from the colonial narratives by the invading empires, like this civilization being unable to govern itself. Also, this is what the elder generations were taught in public schools during the communist period of Poland, so before 1989. So that's what the majority of the middle-aged and elderly population know about the state. It was like a horrible chaos of feudal anarchy. And the recent, pretty new narrative is PLC as a slave labor empire, actually as a colonizer. So this narrative looks away from colonization by the neighboring empires. It built a narrative of the PLC being a colonizer in relation to the Rus lands, as Polish nobles who enslaved Russian peasantry, the Russian population. So it partially draws from post-colonial theory of the modern day, partially it also echoes the narrative of the colonial empire depicting this Polish civilization as something that had to be partitioned and modernized by an external force because it was hopelessly cruel and barbaric in its essence. How much time do I have? Can you tell me?
About 12 minutes.
How many?
12.
12, cool. So this is the beginning of the third part of my talk when I finally reach the stage when I can say how this history and heritage discourses influence the role-playing and reenactment scene in Poland. So there's one game that has to be discussed with special attention. Dzikie Pola, it means the wild fields. It's a reference to the steppes of Ukraine. Released in 1997, so it came only 8 years after the liberation, another liberation of Poland from the Russian dependency. And what happened during these 8 years? Well, it was a time when Poland, as a finally independent country, had to redefine its heritage and its identity now in the club of Western democracies. So, of course, we would expect the rejection, the abandonment of the Russian or Soviet traditions. So where would you get new identity from? So there are two main options. Either you embrace Western capitalism and democracy, and you learn from them, or you reach to this PLC part when Polish parliamentarism and rule of law was emerging internally. Actually, it always is a mix of both. Yeah, but you would have enthusiasts of one course over the other. So what were the heritage goals of this game? Declared by authors and also many fans. One motivation was to challenge the patronizing discourses of Western Europe, because some of them echoed this old colonial narrative, painting the Poles as now emerging from the Soviet world as an inferior political culture that has to learn democracy, has to learn the modern ways from the West. So like a reminder that we do have democratic traditions of our own was a motivation that fueled the production of this game. Another idea to write a Polish game in a Polish setting, whereas the market was overwhelmingly flooded with translations of American, English, German, Western pop culture and mass culture. So Polish novelists complained that it was difficult to sign a contract with a Polish name as the author. They would rather use an English-sounding nickname. And another goal was to revive the PLC setting, like picture setting, as a historical adventure fiction. You could put next to the Three Musketeers in France, or next to the samurai, next to the Caribbean pirates in the 17th century. So you would have the Polish-Lithuanian, Ruthenian nobles and Cossacks and Tatars as a new setting. We had two editions. The first edition was a sort of parodistic focus on the vices of poor landless nobles in search of money and fame. And these guys, the player characters, would impersonate many vices from the negative discourses. Like the Polish noblemen are always drunk, hot-headed, naive, but overly proud, always believing in equality. Well, there was a common slogan saying that every noble in Poland is equal to any other. There were no barons, no counts, no viscounts, except for the Ruthenian princes. They kept their titles. And every citizen could be elected king. So you didn't have to be ruled by royal blood. In reality, it didn't work like that, but that's what every poor nobleman could boast about. I am equal to the kings. I can be king as well. I'm a free citizen. So how this game engaged with the discourses? So on the one hand, it did emphasize the democratic traditions. Poland as a country that tried to build rule of law and democracy, liberty for all citizens, not peasants, noble citizens. But also they played a lot on the images of anarchic noblemen, troublemakers, firebrands, thugs, and also oligarchy. And this game used all the themes I mentioned on the previous slides. All these images of the PLC re-emerged with one additional theme, which was personal flavor of one of the authors. It also played a lot on beliefs in devils, also folkloristic, like Slavic devils, people who are characteristics, like people who signed a pact with the devil, so they have supernatural powers. I joined the team on the stage of the second edition, which I co-authored. And what I brought to the team was a rejection of this parodistic, light-hearted way. I tried to make it a comprehensive view of society. So not only those frontier adventures like Wild West posses, but also the presentation of different classes of nobility. Also, we introduced women and non-nobles as player characters. It hadn't been the case with the first edition. But in terms of its engagement with existing discourses and themes, it was the same. Now, Dzikie Pola inspired a LARP community as well. So why do I say that Dzikie Pola is so influential? It wasn't very influential in terms of sales. It was still a small community, but nonetheless, people were very active, and the LARPing scene that used the PLC setting emerged mainly, or almost exclusively, from the community of Dzikie Pola players. So an interesting thing happened in these LARPs. They were, well, sometimes we had doubts whether these are LARPs at all. If they are very, very low on character personas, very low on mechanics and plot, it's more like a themed party, costume party. And the main source of fun was simply the experience of being in this world, or being a Sarmatian nobleman. Sarmatian was a collective word and covering Polish and Lithuanian nobility. So Sarmatia is like Albion for England, or Gallia for France, like this romantic name for the country. What were the core features of this shared identity? Number one, it was the appreciation of civil liberties, like a tradition, a heritage for a democratic nation, and democratic participation as well. Secondly, appreciation of the political and cultural heritage of PLC, and also self-identification as its descendant. It was a part of, identity building, community building activity. And what happened then with this community? Most involved players followed the PLC, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, in other venues. So you had a lot of role players joining historical reenactment, getting active in historical education, also targeted at audiences outside of the role-playing scene, animation of culture and arts event, the consumption, and also in some degree production of other media that used the PLC as the setting, including game making. We had a collectible card game set in this world, authored by it doesn't mean that all authors were former Dzikie Pola players, but they were active in all these venues nonetheless. The Hearts of Stone DLC to Witcher 3 uses a lot of characters, imagery, motifs from this heritage. And some of the writers used to be in the Dzikie Pola community. Gran Colonia, its Polish edition, added Sarmatia, its highly fantasy version, to the world. And when it came to 7th Sea, authored by John Wick, when he came to Poland as the author of the first edition, he got persuaded by Polish players to add a Poland to the next edition. So it wasn't authored by Polish players, but they were an influence on John Wick to add this state. When I mentioned education, that some role players are interested, have a motivation to promote this heritage, to educate about its heritage, it will essentially be the same space of conflicting narratives that I mentioned, but well, carefully selected. So education, if people have a positive attitude towards that heritage, it highlights the fact that it was a unique union of peoples and cultures, and its predecessor to the EU, that it was this cradle of liberties, democratic rule of law with elected kings, and contrasting with despotisms in the East and absolutisms in the West. Another part is the national costume, the saber, the horse, the lifestyle of PLC nobles, and the memory of famous victories with a special place for winged hussars. And also an important part is a more nuanced view of the social classes, because there was a huge diversity within the noble estate, within the peasant estate, within the burghers estate. What is rarely spoken of is the serfdom, the brutality, and also the shameful final stage of decline before the partition. I have 1 minute to speak about historical reenactment. It's different with historical reenactment. A large part of the group are infantry, not noble cavalry, so they don't even have this persona of the noble to impersonate or to pretend to be. And the reenactors tended to distrust role-playing in general. Also because medieval reenactment was flooded by fantasy role players who preferred to imagine they have the best gear possible so they wouldn't have to buy it. So for the reenactor, if you wanted role playing, it was like a hallmark of that you will have crappy gear at events. But with many role players joining historical reenactment, this light role play, like stylized language or songs, became normalized, especially with the noblemen reenactors. Also, winged hussars resurfaced as elite cavalry. It's super expensive. One difference is paramount. I write about it in my book, that reenactment is sort of a natural ally of conservatism and nationalism, because most of the reenactments are battles and also traumatic events, but nonetheless the struggles of the nation. So it naturally resonates with the nation building, with heritagization of the past by the current government, and also by the church, because the past was much more religious than today's world. So we can also see collaboration between the church, between local administration, also between national government and organizers of reenactment events, including funding of hussar units. We have a few hussar units of a specific land, specific voivodeship funded by the local government. And so it may be not surprising that some outspoken leaders of winged hussars are openly anti-Semitic, anti-Ukrainian, and Catholic fundamentalists, which heavily contrasts with PLC funds coming from the role-playing scenes that tend to be much more progressive and pro-EU. Of course, it's not a clear boundary. I have the last two slides. What does it look like now? How does it translate into Polish relations with Ukraine and the UA now? So anti-EU nationalists tend to be anti-Ukraine too as well. So we have this slogan, "Stop the Ukrainization of Poland" by the refugees, whereas former PLC players campaign for mutual understanding. They want to build heritage narrative on those periods, those moments where the Polish and Ruthenian populations collaborated. Right now, there is a project which I will not speak about because I have no time. Just the last slide. So now this heritage has some grim relevance, which wasn't the case when I was choosing this topic for the presentation. But now we have Russia as an active threat to all ex-PLC nations again. We have millions of refugees in Poland, so Poland used to be most mono-ethnic country, but now with a few millions of Ukrainians, we have the same situation, not the same, but we still have Poles and Ukrainians living side by side, the sort of what it was like in the PLC. And the PLC heritage increasingly often emerges in public debates. There is the idea of the Commonwealth of 3 nations that was attempted twice and failed twice in our shared history. But there was an idea that it could be not just Poland and Lithuania, but also Ruthenia, like Ukraine, as a third component state. And we have a shared history also of kicking Russian ass. So my final thought is that, yes, this PLC role-playing scene, it seems to have died in the 2010s or so. But the sudden interest in this bridge building between Poland and Ukraine may bring it back. And there are a few projects that indicate that it may happen. So I do think that PLC role-plays have an important role to play. Thank you.